Hi, welcome to Music for the Soul podcast, where we talk honestly about difficult things. This is a place where music, hope, and healing come together. I'm Becky Nordquist.
And I'm Steve Seiler. We have a very interesting episode for you today. We're going to talk about the use of the arts in healing sexual trauma. And to do that, we have with us someone who has a lot of experience in this field, and her name is Vicki Didato. Vicki, welcome.
Glad to be here.
We're so glad you're with us today, Vicki. We really appreciate you.
Well, Vicki, you have been somebody that has worked with Music for the Soul for many years, or I should say, we with you at conferences. And we've had the privilege of hearing about the different ways that you use our music in healing in therapy sessions, both individual and group. So it's just really an honor to have a chance to talk with you about this and share with our listeners about some of the ways that the arts can heal trauma. How did you first get into that particular area of your field?
I would have to say through the back door. It was in all my schooling, education, it was not taught. It's something, to be quite honest, that my clients taught me because I knew that what we call traditional talk therapy was not working. And at times, not only was it not working, I started to suspect that the way we were trained literally could drive trauma deeper. And so I just started praying, doing more and more research, picking other people's brains, just knowing there was something out there that would have to make more sense than what we were doing. So I'll give you a brief background. This was not at all counseling, the field that I wanted to go into. My undergrad was in law enforcement at Penn State, and I worked at a police department, a prison. I was a probation parole officer. So that was my perspective. And interestingly enough, I ended up working with sex offenders, again, not by choice, but that's just how it worked out. And so in hindsight, I'm so grateful for that experience for those first several years, because I know me enough to know I never would have worked with child victims of sexual abuse first. And then one day thought, gee, I think I'll go work with offenders. But yeah, that's just the reality. So most of my peers in my field are very much focused that way. So I felt I really learned, I hate to say this, but in this context, from the experts. And they taught me so much that I have used over the years with survivors, with victims. So I ended up going back to school because I felt very ill prepared. Ended up working as an investigator at Children's Services, investigating abuse cases, then being a guardian ad litem, legally taking the cases to court. And through a lot of different job changes, I developed a course. It really was the course I wish I'd had as a student in graduate school. And so I, for years, taught that course at 4 universities in Ohio, training other therapists in what we call left brain, right brain therapy. And that's, I say it was purely by, hate to say trial and error, but my clients taught me every step of the way.
I would say by God's design, Vicki, as I tell that story.
Yeah.
Can I back up to you? Something you said that I thought was fascinating. Why would you say that traditional counseling can drive the trauma deeper?
I'm giving you a real quick neurological, and it's insufficient, but it'll get the conversation started. So we all work out of left brain, right brain. By design, by the way we're made, Becky and I as females work mostly out of the right hemisphere of our brain. Steve, you as a male work out of your left. Now, that does not mean that any of us are deficient or any of us are better than the other. What it means is, and I really believe this, God designed us so that we have to have the other. We have to work together. So talk therapy in the left brain is where logic is, and the right brain is where emotions and where trauma is stored. And now I want to be clear as a counselor, I don't trash my field, so to speak. Counseling is absolutely, or therapy is necessary. I won't say that's the only route to healing, but I want to be clear. There's nothing wrong with therapy. It is a tool like support groups, prayer, Bible study. I mean, anything, friends, just listening. It is definitely a valuable tool. But when you're talking about, and most of my work has been with deep deep-rooted trauma and repetitive trauma over long periods of time. What we call traditional talk therapy is focused solely in the left brain, and it will not get them to healing. It might give them awareness. It might teach them some tools for functioning, but it won't move them into healing. And so people can literally what I call narrate their story or narrate their trauma. And in doing that, if they never move it over to the right brain, it can just drive it deeper. Hope that makes sense. But that's why music, art, the five senses, taste, we use, believe it or not, taste, touch, scent. There are ways to use that in therapy. Anything it will bypass and get right into the limbic system.
I appreciate that explanation so much. And I know a lot of our listeners are therapists, and I'm sure the question they're all sitting on the edge of their seat with is they're going to want a practical idea and ways that they can use the arts in their own practices. And even for the average listener, those of us who have walked through chronic abuse or navigating the waters of therapy, so I really have a twofold question for you is perhaps we could start with, if I'm just the average Joe and maybe I haven't started therapy or maybe I'm in a traditional therapy setting, are there things that I can do at home that would help to cross that bridge from left brain to right brain and bringing, kind of marrying, so to speak, the facts of something that happened and remarrying it to my emotions on the right side?
There are all kinds of, I hate to call them tricks, but little things, as long as they're working with someone. This is where I hate to just give out, here are 10 little, tricks to bypass your left brain. Because what we found, and I always tell my clients, when they're coming in for whatever trauma they want worked on, I always, as all therapists do a real quick assessment of what's going on in the rest of their life. And one of the things I learned very early on in my training from Judith Herman is that you cannot heal in the midst of trauma. So I remember a woman that came, just to give an example, she was an incest survivor and we had a new group starting and I felt the group would be great for her. But the more I listened to her, her husband had just left her. She had lost a child in the last 6 months. She had been diagnosed with cancer and their child was going through divorce. And I thought, wow, this is not the time to open up and unearth more trauma. She just needed to know how to stabilize and function. So that served me well. So I always tell people, take an assessment of, is this a good time in your life or optimum time to deal with trauma? If it is, then there are things, I don't call them homework or assignments, but I always go by the rule of thumb. If you're like me, I want the shortest route. Like, why do you want to pay more money for a longer time, no matter what that is? And so I say, I will help you, but all I am is a tool used by God. I can help you, but only God can heal. So here's some things you can do on your own. But that is what's important. It's like I see most of my clients. Now, keep in mind, this isn't typical therapy, but most of my clients are trauma. I see them in 2-hour sessions because we've discovered for the most part, it takes them 35 to 45 or more minutes to just kind of feel safe, get in there, unwind before we can even approach the trauma. You can't put people in a 55-minute hour and then say, see ya. So it's intense work.
I can't tell you how many times I've thought the very thing you just said. How can you possibly get to a place where you can go that deep and achieve any kind of healing and then say, oh, well, I'm sorry, our time is up.
Yeah.
When
Right.
you probably just have touched the surface of what's going on.
Yeah,
And then-
I can speak to that as personally because I'm definitely survived quite a bit of traumatic
Stuff.
chronic stuff.
Mhm.
And there was two things. First of all, amen. I have to say, as someone who has sat in the therapist's office for many years because of all the trauma that I've experienced trying to work through it, there's two things that you said that were crucially, like I say, amen. The first one is you cannot heal in the midst of trauma. And I think so many people that are in situations, they don't even realize because of the chronic situation of trauma in their life whether it's abuse, but then moving into more abusive relationships. Maybe it's not a sexual abuse relationship, but perhaps there's other types of abuse. Like you had talked about this woman's husband leaving her, and then, you have kids going through trauma, which as a mother, you kind of experience that in a secondhand way because you feel for your kids. I can't tell you how many times in my life I was trying to work through my childhood chronic sexual abuse.
Mhm.
And then I was just having more trauma and then a bunch of losses. And then, and then we have another pregnancy loss. And then we have another, it was just like waves, waves. And you feel like it's like trying to climb a muddy mountain.
Oh,
You just try to
mhm.
get a foothold and you can't. You get a little further and then you're sliding back down the mountain. And then you try to reach for more and you think you got a grip and then you're sliding back down. And it's the importance of gracing yourself and saying it's okay to only stabilize and work through this moment and breathe. I had such a pressure on myself I got to work through all that stuff. I got to work through all that stuff. But sometimes just getting stable is the biggest job and gift you can give yourself. And
Mhm.
just to take that deep breath, and that the moment will come where the ground's going to dry and you'll have better traction. So that was the first thing that I was like, oh, yes, thank you. And then the second thing you said, and Steve, you emphasized, was the time limits. And I can't tell you how many times, because it's very difficult to talk about trauma, especially when you have been told that you can't talk about it. Sometimes you physically cannot talk about it, which I
Mhm.
hope we'll touch on today too, why that is, that it's so hard to talk about. But that place where it takes you a moment to kind of regulate and say, I'm safe to go a little bit deeper here. I'm safe to open up my mind and my heart to the painful events that occurred and have caused me to shake literally on the inside for many years.
Becky, you actually used the phrase, I can't talk about it. And that was the cassette tape, Vicky, that you found in your office. If I'm remembering the story correctly, that
Yes.
began our journey together. And of course, on the I Can't Talk About It project was a song called Innocent Child, which has been important in our relationship. Can you talk a little bit about how first finding that drew your attention?
Yes. And thank you, Becky, for that segue without knowing.
Yes.
So I was always decades ago looking for new things, trying to think outside the box. Like I said, there was nothing that I could find. And I started looking at neuroscience just outside the box. And I came across a number of books. I just started using books, what I call vignettes, taking something like Forrest Gump and taking 5 minutes out of that scene with Jenny and Forrest, which would mean nothing to anyone else. But I'm telling you, that scene I use all the time at conferences when she throws the stones. So that's the left brain, right brain. One of the things I came across was a book by, was it Doris Sanford?
Yes.
Called I Can't Talk About It, and it had the Love Dove. I used that book and I used some interesting CDs, sung lyrics by a man named Steve Seiler, who I didn't even know existed. I used them constantly in my office. And that was within 2 minutes. I would just say, I want to play a song or I want to play a lyric. I might not even play the whole song, but a client would have a specific memory about something. And I'd play that and boom, what usually takes what I say an hour of talk therapy, they would be there in their right brain in the limbic system. Now, you want to know what you're doing. That's why I hesitate earlier to say I don't want to give out a list of tricks, but if you're going to go there, it's important you be there with somebody safe. It doesn't have to be a therapist, but when I give them their assignments, I say make sure you have, whether it's a spouse, a friend, sometimes a prayer partner, something, or have access if you're going to do these assignments. My clients are all sexual trauma survivors. However, they've also experienced breast cancer, suicide, loss, death, loss of a child, infertility. There's just divorce. They're all over. And so I will use different music, songs, movie vignettes to get them to that moment where then we can help them process. it's interesting that we have a triune brain, and I find that more than fascinating. Most people don't even know that. They go, "What? We have a triune brain?" But we need all three parts. And I believe that spiritually, physically, emotionally. And as I said, only the left brain or talk therapy accesses the one, and we need all three. So all of that to say, for years I used these songs, and then I was looking it up, Steve. I think it was at least my PowerPoint is dated May 2nd, 2009, when I gave a talk at the International Human Trafficking Conference in California, Pasadena. And during a break after my talk, I went out and there's a table full of CDs, full of music. I looked down and I started to recognize all these CDs I had used over the years. And there was a gentleman behind the table, and I looked up and I don't know what I said, but something like, "Oh my gosh, I use these things." And I had no idea that you were the person behind the table. And I was just raving about, I think then, Steve, you just smiled and introduced yourself. And I was so delighted. And that's how we actually met face to face, and then just started brainstorming. And over the years, it took a long time, but we started healing sexual trauma, healing trauma through the arts. And our friend Verna Horvath is an artist. And I just started to step outside the box and say, what would happen if? And then we went to healing through the arts. And so I would do the teaching on the left brain, right brain, talk about trauma. We used trauma survivors to come and share their stories. Verna would do art classes. Steve would do the music, sing the songs, and people just got so much out of it. Plus, they didn't just come by themselves. Most of them came with people they knew, which made it safer, so that when the conference was over, they could go somewhere with someone and walk. They could go out to dinner. They brought their spouses. Like, it was a whole environment of healing.
I love the idea that you address the fact that people not do this alone. I think it's so important to first of all, that's one of the reasons I think songs can be helpful, because if there's a song about something you've been through, it's so easy to fall into thinking that you're the only person this has ever happened to, that your story is the most shameful, the most ugly. And to be in a room full of others and hear the testimonies and hear songs and see art and realize I am not alone in this. And there are others who are walking this road, and there are others who have healed or are healing, who can help me work through this and get to a place of wholeness and restoration. And I just obviously loved being a part of, I think we've done 3 of those together. And as we're talking, I'm thinking it's time for the 4th. Because
Well, do you remember the 4th was COVID? That's what shut it down. Yes, we did 17, 18, 19 in 3 different states. In 2020, it all shut down.
Yeah. Being a part of a weekend like that, it is, how do I put it? I mean, fulfilling is not the right word, but I think you can understand that as a creative person, you create things in hopes that they will reach and minister and bless the people that you are intending to serve. And in an environment like that, you do see that, and you do see that resonance and that multiplication that gives meaning to the work.
Well, and I think as I'm listening, these conferences it's a large segment of time, which so often in our world, we're balancing family and work and all these other things. And when you can get a huge block of time like that to focus on healing, I just think that would be so beneficial. Again, we're back to that time thing, right? Where we're looking at being able to relax into a safe place and a haven, if you will, so that you have the time to marry the two sides of the brain together. And I wondered, this is kind of breaking away from that a little bit, but I wondered if you give us a little science lesson here on the triune brain. I find it so fascinating that there are so many areas in creation that just reflect God in that triune manner. And I just think it might be helpful to have a little bit of a science lesson today. Could you help us with that, Vicki?
I'll do my best. And I am not an expert in this, but I know enough to do what I do. But it's called the R complex brain. No one knows what that is. But if I say reptilian brain, People have heard that, and that includes the brainstem and the cerebellum. And that part of the brain controls reflex, muscle control, balance, breathing, heartbeat, things we don't have to stop and think about. And it's very reactive to direct stimulation. So I'm going to bounce back and forth. All of this works for everyone. Then I'll come back and tell you what trauma does to it.
Would that also include the central nervous system?
Yes, it does. The limbic brain is the amygdala, hypothalamus, and hippocampus. And that's generally those terms you hear when we're talking about trauma. Our instincts, that attachment, survival instincts are all in that. And when that part of the brain is activated, emotion comes. So we don't get real emotional breathing, doing all those things. But when we fight, flight, or freeze, I always call it fight, flight, or fright because it just is easier for my clients to remember. But fright is the freeze stage. So that you get an emotional response. And here's where so many trauma survivors also are highly susceptible to addictions of all kinds, is that in the limbic part of the brain, it's either pain and pleasure. And so the way we're designed, and it's not a defect, I want to be clear on that, is when we're in pain, we are wired to do anything to get out of it. And so many people, once they've experienced pain or right after a memory, whatever, can go without being aware of it into looking for something to give them pleasure. So you talk about addiction, you talk about alcohol, food. It doesn't have to be the negatives that society puts the labels on. It could be anything, workaholism. But that's where they go. It's almost an innate response to try to balance out what's going on in the brain. So that's something we have to be aware of in therapy too, that the deeper you go in the pain, the more we have to talk about, okay, how are you going to balance out in healthy ways? The neocortex, or the cerebral part of the brain, is the third, and it's really the more evolved part of the brain. And that's like what we call executive functioning, where we reason, wisdom. It's like we can process and have reactions, but this is where animals don't have this that we do, where we can process and then come to terms and say, okay, I want to do this, but I'm not going to because I know that's not healthy for me or whoever. And I choose to, whatever it is, rise above, to not return violence, for example. That's where the concept of forgiveness, that's not going to be in the instinct. When someone hits us, our instinct is to hit back or run or all of those things. That is not the time. And this is one other thing I'll throw in as a therapist who clearly believes that forgiveness is part of healing. Having said that, I will tell you that I would say my experience has been the church or Christians or therapists, if that's there. Some therapists, and I understand why I say that's not even an option. That's not even therapeutic. So it depends on where the client is. But I will say this. If a pastor says, well, don't you believe in forgiveness? And I say, absolutely, but for the client as part of their healing. But that is the last stage of healing. And people frequently try to put it first or second or third or fourth. I'm like, oh, no, that is one of the goals, but that comes at the end. You have to first know what it is you're even forgiving.
When we first released I Can't Talk About It, there is a segment. It first happened as a play with songs. And when we first released it, one of the first things that came up was the forgiveness piece of it. Was very challenging for some. And so I started talking with a lot of therapists and a lot of survivors about that. And the place we finally came to that I thought was really helpful and that I've heard from people is helpful is moving to the word releasing. In fact, Dr. Doris Sanford, who wrote I Can't Talk About It, was the first person to share that idea with me, that in forgiveness, you are releasing the person. It's like, what you did to me was not all right, but I release you because I can't move forward if I carry that hate with me. So that's your thing. I pray you get the help you need. You go and get your healing. But I'm going to release you because holding on to this hate, that unforgiveness is harming me into the future. So that word seems to be more something people can receive better than the word forgiveness, which comes with baggage.
Right.
I have to say, my trauma was over the course of a lot of years, and I was forced to keep it secret. So I remember looking at my father, who was a pastor at the time, and I was essentially calling him out. I was a teenager, and I said, "Why didn't you do anything?" I was angry, very angry at him. I was angry at God. I thought that God had cheated me out because I loved the Lord, and I was taught that he was, he would make me safe. That was my
Mhm.
thinking.
Mhm.
And this was nothing safe. Obviously, I'm struggling with both my earthly father and my heavenly father all at the same time. But
Uh-huh.
my dad's words were like, "You just need to forgive and forget." And I remember thinking in that moment, I know forgiveness is something that I will eventually get to, but I'll never, ever, ever forget what happened. And then, Steve, as you were saying, that release, it is such a great word. And for the person that's really angry, it's like, I'm so angry and I tighten my fists, like I'm clutching onto something. And what helped me to understand, I don't know if this is going to help anybody that's listening that's maybe in this process or in this place, but I had to visualize releasing, opening my hands that I literally or figuratively had around the necks of my abusers,
Mhm.
if you will, like because of the anger, because of all the things that are tied in there, I had to envision releasing them and dropping into the hands of my God, who says, "Vengeance is mine, says the Lord.
Mhm.
I will repair." But then later he took me a step further and he opened my eyes to see that they were damaged individuals
Mhm.
and that the best way, the best thing for everybody, me and them, is to let him deal with it. Let God be God and let him work in a manner that will affect them, but then also heal me. And perhaps, and now where I sit today, ultimately heal them.
One of the deepest core issues, we call them, there are many, but is power and control. So we're used to knowing that offenders have power and control issues. That makes sense. But that is the core issue for every survivor
Yes.
is power and control. So we can spend a lifetime trying to regain power and control. And I could go through the DSM-5 and tell you that every disorder in there, every disorder, there are hundreds, at root, it sounds so simplistic, has its origins in power and control. So what I like about release is it implies that the power or the control of it lies with the survivor. They get to choose whether or not they release it. It takes the power and control away from anyone else. And to me, that's the crux of therapy is you get to choose or be in control. And I have clients I've worked with that have had tremendous healing. They'll say, I will never, ever forgive. And you know what? That is their choice. I will never push someone or say, well, then you can't be here. I take them where they are. That's it. But one of the things that you mentioned, and I just want to can briefly describe not to make it too simplistic, is something I kind of coined or worked through with clients years ago, and I call it traumatic reenactment. It's not something that you mess with. You need to know what you're doing because it will definitely trigger and open up, but then it can access some of the deepest parts.
Mm.
Now, as a therapist who's licensed, there are many things I can't nor should do, even if I think they would be therapeutic. And that's a whole nother session. But here was the value of group. And so I'll just use that example when you said your hands around their throats, their necks. That's what made me think of this, Becky. I worked with many, many women over the years, and men for that matter, who have been bound, gagged, tied, been choked or had weapons held to them. And obviously they're going to have deeper core issues than any time there is a threat of physical death. The issues go the deepest in the brain. And so they're going to be harder to tell. And when they do tell, they're going to have more fallout, after effects than anyone. So we have to know how to deal with this. But we had a woman, or had worked with her for years. I knew her story. She had been choked, had a knife held to her throat. She never, ever screamed or cried about her abuse. She could narrate it, but she was always in her left brain. And as a result of group, we don't have the time for it, but we did some activities in group where they all felt safe. And I knew, I'd known for over a year she needed to scream, but there are two levels of that. So one of the things I would do in my office, and, we would make sure that there were no other office. It would be at night when all the other offices were closed in the building. And I never, ever ask someone to do something I'm not willing to do. That's just, so no matter what it is. So I said, well, I'm just going to scream. But here's the difference. She really wasn't in danger and she felt very safe in my office. But nonetheless, I'm not going to tell her to just scream. So I said, I'm going to scream. She goes, oh, no, you can't. I go, no, I'm going to scream and you just scream after me. So that was level one. I screamed. She did it. She honestly initially said, this is stupid. I feel dumb. And to be honest, so did I. But it's like, okay. And so we would do that every session for a while, just scream for 10 seconds. Then in group one night, one of the women got triggered and literally screamed. And then everybody else kind of screamed. Well, here's what traumatic reenactment is. The whole point is she was able to scream, but she was not in danger. She did not feel threatened. And so traumatic reenactment is something that you can reenact as real as it can be without, I want to be very clear, anything unethical. So what the women came up with, we sat and brainstormed one night, and here's what they decided. And the beauty of it was this. I obviously couldn't be involved in any of it. Those roles are very clear, and I couldn't be with them outside of the office. But they decided, we talked about how do you reenact really being scared and screaming and releasing that. See, it's releasing actually biochemicals that have been stored in the brain. So she had to be genuinely scared. So they decided, and it was genius. Where are you really scared, but you're really okay and you're completely in control? Their group of 10 women went to Cedar Point for the day, rode roller coasters all together, like one after the other, screamed their heads off. They were genuinely afraid, but see, the power locus and control was with them. And then they'd get off and go, let's go again.
That is awesome. That's genius. Awesome.
And they did it as a group. And they did, and again, no one else would know. And they didn't stand out like a sore thumb, like most of I love that story. And it's one of my favorites of the power of just group, the power of support. And the next time she was in group and therapy, she could access and really get to the emotion of how terribly terrifying that was that she had gone through, and yet have the support of 9 other women that could hold her while she cried. And I'm just an observer and a guider at that point. Also, survivors were hurt by touch. They need to be healed by touch. There are all kinds of creative ways to work with that. That's one of the boundaries, though, in therapy, as it should be.
When you mentioned this woman who couldn't scream and who was silent, it reminded me of one of the first responses that I got from a therapist to the song Innocent Child. She said that she had been working with a client for 2 years who could not cry about her abuse. And she said she heard your song and she hasn't stopped crying. She's letting all the pain out. And from what I hear you say, that's the difference of moving it from the left brain into the right brain.
Right. Exactly. And Steve, if we have time, I want to share one song of yours. I think you'll know where I'm headed. Vicki, I work with, I haven't mentioned it to now, but mostly individuals with DID, dissociative identity disorder. A lot of people don't know what that is, and I don't like to say, but they know it when I say it used to be multiple personality disorder. And one of the best things I learned in my work in changing how we were taught as therapists to deal with that is to see it and to teach them. That was a gift. You are not strange, weird, dysfunctional. Everyone has a distorted view of what that is. It is 100% treatable and 100% curable and can be integrated. Now, I won't say it always happens, but it can be. And there are very few other mental health disorders that you can say that about. So just letting them know that that was a gift from God. It's how our brains are created. Now, it happens early on. You can be traumatized at any age, but to form a brain that becomes, dissociative, that has that capacity, that has to happen before age 5 to 7. But like any coping mechanism, the very thing that saved you now, as you age, get older, move into different stages of life, can become the very thing that is harming you. And so it's got to be healed, balanced. I had worked with a woman for years. She hadn't shared because it had been so repressed that she had a teenage part that had been was a part of human trafficking. And that alter's name was Renee. And it started when she was 14. Okay, Steve writes a song. Renee is 14. I almost fall off my chair hearing this song. I play it in my office, and this client gets all of her memories from a song. I worked with her for a couple of years. I play one song written by Steve, and she is there. And we then start the process of dealing with all of those years as a teenager where she was trafficked. And to add to the story, at one of the healing arts conferences, she was one of the survivors that stood up and gave her story, and then blessed so many in the audience who came to her then. And Steve got to meet her. But earlier you struggled with what's the word, fulfilling, satisfying. I can remember those moments like that, feeling the emotion now in my voice, where you have a moment. It's a spiritual, I don't even know what to say.
Yes.
It's a spiritual moment where you see all things kind of come 360, and you can't replicate it. You can't say, oh, let's do that again tomorrow. It's just a merging of all the hard work, prayer, whatever. And then the spirit shows up and you see incredible healing. And I don't have a word for it other than it makes me feel all those days I want to quit and go, I'm done. I don't want to do this anymore. I have one moment like that, and it can make up for years of disappointment.
Yes.
It's kind of like that moment you get a front row seat to a supernatural experience. Because, even in, we talked a little bit about forgiveness and stuff. I was talking with a friend recently, and I was like, there's all the things that you can set yourself up to choosing to forgive or release, whatever word you want to put on it. But in my experience, there is a place in me that I cannot put hands on. I cannot force it. I can't make it happen. I can't do a 5-step program. All I can do is release the desire to get there into the hands of my creator. And there's just something that he does, whether it's a shift of the heart or a healing of a scar or a wound, if you will. But there is a place that can't be touched or manipulated by human hands. And what you're describing and I've experienced it too at different moments with people, to just get that front row seat blessing of watching all the hard work and all of the stewardship of what we've been given in our gifts and our learnings. And as we offer those things out to those who need them, I feel like it's a gift that he gives us to get to have a front row seat to all of the closure for someone, or some of the closure and healing for another person.
I would be remiss if I didn't add this, and if I could, I work with offenders too. And so that is maybe unusual, or sometimes it puts people off. But as I said, I started out my first few years working with sex offenders, and I got to see them as hurting individuals, as broken people, and to see them as created in God's image too, that went awry, just like all of us. And I have a heart for offenders. Sometimes I really get criticized for that, but I would be remiss if I didn't put that in this broadcast and say I have seen families, particularly survivors and offenders, reconcile. That's a whole nother thing, and that should never be the goal of a survivor's healing. I'm just saying it can happen, and I've witnessed it. And one of the scriptures the Lord gave me years ago, it's Isaiah 42:22. And it says, "But this is a people plundered and looted, all of them trapped in pits or hidden away in prisons. They have become plunder with no one to rescue them. They have been made loot with no one to say, 'Send them back.'" And that was for me when the Lord said, "Vicki, I've called you to the plundered and the looted. I want you to help send them back." And that's one of my life scriptures for what I do.
I love that so much. One of the most healing moments of my life was when the Lord showed me very much that verse.
Mm.
And I suddenly had a different vision of those that hurt me and violated me. And the question I had in my head immediately was, what must have happened to them to push them to a place to do those horrible things to me? God, I don't know what their story is. I don't know what kind of pain, what kind of trauma they carried. And there was this overwhelming, in a weird way, compassion that flooded my heart for them. And I got to this place, and it's not of me. I mean, you can't, like I said, there's no 5-step program. But when you relinquish your life over to the Spirit of a living God, there isn't a lot of human words that can make sense, right? For a process like this. But I came to a place where actually, where I sit right now in my life, is nothing would bring me greater joy than to see them come to know the mercy and grace of God to its full extent. And doesn't mean that I would ever have a relationship with these people, but I know that my God loves them just like he loves me. He doesn't love what they did, just like he doesn't love a lot of what I've done. But there is room for everyone at the foot of the cross. And that blood covers a multitude of sins. And that includes mine. Our God is so good and so gracious. And, we would be remiss to think that we don't have someone who has violated or hurt another person listening and thinking that they've gone too far, they can never be forgiven. And that's just not true. We have a God who loves and forgives all of us.
Vicki, this conversation has been remarkable, and I'm so grateful for you and for your ministry, your presence in my life, and all of the wisdom that you share and the gifts that you bring. If someone wants to get in touch with you or learn more about the work you do, how do they find you?
I'd give my email, and it's DOTK, so DOTK7 at AOL.com.
Okay, thank you so much for sharing that, and thank you so much for being with us.
Yes, thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Thank you, Becky and Steve.
I thank you again for the work that you've done, that you're doing. And I'm sure that email will maybe get some good use from other therapists who would like to learn more from you about how they can include the arts and music and all of these wonderful tools into their sessions with survivors as well. So thank you so much for sharing your heart and your gifts and your knowledge with us today. Just love you to pieces. Thank you so much, Vicki.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed the discussion today, please share it with a friend and give us a positive review on iTunes.
And I just want to mention as we go out today, we'll go ahead and play the song that Vicki referenced, Renee is 14. We have several songs at our website that are specifically designed to speak to the hearts of sexual trauma survivors, and you can see those at musicforthesoul.org. You can stream or download every song in our catalog, read our lyrics, our healing music guide, our blog posts, and much more. Thank you so much for listening. God bless you. Renee is 14, her family like pieces of broken glass, running from pain that
that she can't outlast, an innocent victim of her past. She hitches a ride Interstate 40 towards Hollywood. Maybe there she will be understood. At least she knows that the weather's good. She arrives with dreams, but she's in beyond her means, and inside her a child's voice screams for someone to care. Renee needs a home. She squats in a shack down on Gardner Street, in the shadow of wealth and the town's elite, wondering each day what she'll have to eat. She sells what she must, she'd rather not, but there's no way out. Survival becomes what her world's about. On the street, money is all that counts. No time for tears, anger hurts less than fear. Heart beyond her years and too tired to care. Renee is alive, but each day one more part of her soul is dead. Could we have afforded to turn her